Welcome back. Once again, it's your Khan, here by the Fireside. Come on in, make yourself at home, pull up a fur, get yourself a drink, because today is another chance to talk with your Khan. First off, as I always like to start off with, is my shout-outs. First and foremost, I'd like to shout out to the Down Under 40k League and podcast, Dale and Ben, doing the God Emperor's work. Loving what you're doing. And if you haven't done it, go across to their Spotify and check it out. They've got an ongoing series about running a local league. It's very fancy. I won't steal their thunder. You got to check it out. They are doing a great job. And of course, if you want to check that out in person, IRL, you can go down to Maitland Good Games at 449 High Street, Maitland, and tell them the Khan sent you. Talk to Jacob and the team. So, back again with your Khan, just a quick update. This has been a little hot minute since I've done one of these, namely because the Khan became a father. Little man's down for the count at the moment. He's had a feed. He's loving life. He's out in his bassinet, just loving it. So I decided to quickly get this done and catch us up, because there's a topic that's just been red hot to me in the last few weeks, especially listening to the work of the Priority Roll podcast. They've done 2 podcasts on talking about the meta, which is your Khan's favourite. I love the game's evolving meta. I love it so much. Last time we spoke about how to get good, and I think a part of getting good is understanding the meta. Now, for new players, you might not have heard this before. If you're a D&D player, you might have even heard of metagaming. It's a little phrase that's worked its way into the community, and I'll explain it. But I'm going to go a roundabout way in explaining it because, your Khan enjoys a bit of a yarn. So let's talk about a gentleman by the name of Darius. Great player. He appeared on the scene in 522 BCE, and he works his way up to a little event called the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. So you're asking yourself right now, what the hell does a battle between Greeks and Persians in 490 BC have to do with the current meta, or tabletop meta in general? Surprisingly, you're going to be shocked to learn quite a bit. Stick with your Khan on this one. This shit's about to get edutaining. I might actually get to use my ancient history degree. So, we begin our little talk in 522 BCE with a gentleman known as Darius the Great. Now, as someone who's a bit of an expert on this, when someone calls themselves the Great, you know that they are a top bloke and in no way exaggerating who they are. In top bloke, you can trust him. Now, this guy comes in, usurps the top dog role in his local area. Okay? Works his way up to being the top dog in all the local tournament scenes. He smashes it out in Scythia, Egypt, Babylonia, the Indus Valley. Just controls the whole area. You see, he's got a control of it. He knows what the meta is. He's made his list, he's reacted to it, he's got a horde of light infantry, big shooty meta, lots of cavalry, quick moving, able to lock down objectives, having a great day. Now, he loves this. He's done his big whirlwind tour, he's crushed everyone, and now he's sitting back on his laurels, just loving being the top dog. He might even start a paid service where he teaches you how to play better, but we're not quite there yet. Now, along comes this event. Now, this gentleman knows he's the best, and sometimes when you're the best, you get a bit lazy. So Darius got a bit lazy, and he missed something. It was a little comp in a place called Sardis in about 498 BC. Greeks turned up from outside of it, sacked it, absolutely blew it away. Okay? Local area went ballistic, everyone started copying them, thinking the Greeks were the way to go. Darius the Great didn't like this so much, so he had to indulge in another campaign. So him and his mate Datus, who was kind of like his protege, decided to go around and just nullify this idea that the Greeks were the better players. So they reassert themselves in the Ionian League, smash everything, have a good time, sit back. Then they meet this Greek fellow who moves over to Persia by the name of Hippias. Hippias did come from Athens, but he was kicked out for being a narky prick. No one in the local leagues liked him. He was too, bit up himself, bit bossy, bit of a tyrant, you could say. So he had to get the flick, ostracized out of the community. So he hooks in with Darius and his crew and says, look, I want to be part of, Team Persia in your local, team events. So I'm going to teach you all about the Greeks, and I'm going to be your man on the ground, and we're going to go back, we're going to assert ourselves over there, it's going to be great. Darius lets this guy, whisper honey words in his ear and get him all full of piss and vinegar about how they're being shit-talked by their Greek counterparts. Darius thinks, yeah, we're going to go punish him. So he gets his little net list out, and unfortunately, like some of us, he can't get away for every tournament. So he can't get away to go and play in the Greek scene. But he gives his sweet list to his mate Datus, his little protege. And they take over to Greece in about 490 BC to a little place called Marathon. Now, Darius has watched Datus very closely and knows that this guy can just follow what he does. Datus has this net list. He's full of confidence. He turns up at the marathon comp and is absolutely steamrolled. Okay? It's a slaughter fest. Like, we're talking a victory point deficit of 1 to 20. Okay? That's just unreal. And now, what happened? Well, quite frankly, the meta in Greece is very different to the meta in Persia. Hippias, in all of his ranting and raving, left out one key detail. They don't play light infantry in Greece. No. The meta in Greece is heavy infantry. That's right. And those 5-up saves from those light infantry soldiers with their leather and wicker shields, yes, you heard that right, wicker, like a basket. Yeah, we're not at Pottery Barn, we're on the battlefield. And those 5-up saves just weren't cutting against the raw strength and OP power of those high AP weapons wielded by those Greek hoplites. So he gets decimated. Now, this is what I was trying to teach you guys. Hopefully you get it. Okay, so that's my little story about meta. Now let me unpack what the non-theatrical side of it is. The morals of the story. Number 1, meta evolves in a scene. Every scene can have its own meta. And playing from one to another can have disastrous consequences. So before we go any further, I want to stop saying this word meta. It's an acronym. Most effective tactic available. That's all it means. Okay? So when Darius was over in Persia and that area, the most effective tactic available to him was to use that light infantry. Okay? Was to use that high speed. Meanwhile in Greece, smaller area, rockier terrain, it culturally evolved to have a different style of warfare. I mean, Greeks had peltasts, they didn't mind throwing stuff, but the majority of their warfare was armoured rugby scrums. Now, on a tabletop setting, what I want you to understand is a lot of people say the meta is this, the meta is that. So to bring it back to tabletop, let's talk about my faction, good old Space Marines. When I started, I mentioned in 8th edition that I ran mostly regular Firstborn Marines, mounted in Razorbacks, and at the beginning it was fantastic. It was fantastic because just like Darius, I hadn't gone to another area. In my local scene, the meta worked. The second I stepped out of that scene, didn't go so good. Okay? That's what I'm trying to explain to people here. You need to understand what the meta is. So remember those resources I talked about in the last podcast? Quite frankly, the watching other battle reports, listening to the other podcasts, keeping an eye on the forums and on Facebook groups, that sort of stuff. Because the meta changes, and it can change really rapidly. Using my Space Marines as an example, one of the biggest things I'm sure anyone who's been watching 40k recently will know is that Marines finally got good again. Okay? Now, I don't mean Primaris Marines, they've always been fantastic, but I mean my humble Space Marines that were going to go the way of the Thunder Warrior into the realm of legends and myths, as my good friend Ben wants them to go very badly. Ben, we are not going to have legends, I'm sorry, they're going to stick around for a little while yet. So, what affects the meta? Quite simple, it's new rule changes. And the big rule change for Space Marines was they got generous and they gave them more wounds. Terminators were the first thing we saw with a little leak image of their new stat blocks, and 3-wound Terminators, which doesn't sound like a lot, but as a man in my last game who ran 10 Terminators, that's the equivalent of getting 10 extra Terminators. That's fair, like 5 extra Terminators. That's fantastic. I want to keep that going. The other thing we found is Thunder Hammers are now flat 4 damage. And Power Fists stopped being such a random quotient. They went to 2 damage apiece. These sort of things changed the game very dramatically because what happened very quickly after my Wyoming experience was I went, well, regular Marines aren't cutting it, so I started pushing more into the Primaris side. Now we have, which also cuts out tactical options such as missile launchers, flamethrowers, plasma guns, that kind of stuff. You lose that kind of side of it. So now we find ourselves in a situation where suddenly these, Marines that were no good are now drastically improved. A lot of salt, a lot of salt sprinkled throughout the whole community. It's fantastic. I appreciate it. Look, it's hard being the poster boy for the whole 40k franchise, but Space Marines are there, so we get our dues. So how does that change the meta? Well, the first thing I saw instantly was that people were discussing, well, if the regular Marines are so good, why are we taking, Primaris? And to be honest, I can only say it's for the vehicles and for the flavor. Because a regular Marine can get access to rocket launchers, can get access to heavy bolters, can get access to melters, all this other stuff you can't get access to as a Primaris Marine. However, there's also stratagems and things that work for Marines and for Primaris, so it's all about your flavor and your choice of which way you want to go there. As a player who wants to be in tournaments, it's really important to keep an eye on the meta and be aware of how it changes and what you're going to see. So, for example, when Iron Hands came out, people looked for what were the most effective tactics were. And the most effective tactics were things like your triple whirlwinds, your triple thunderfire cannons. Because before the nerf, it was very hard to miss with a thunderfire cannon. Incredibly hard. You had indirect fire, which is easy to sit at the back of the board, just pound the crap out of people. And that's what people wanted to use. So you don't have to have an answer for everything in the meta, because that's something I want to talk about very quickly. There's this idea that you're going to have monsters in the meta, and I don't think that's the case. Yes, the Leviathan Dreadnought or the, I'm trying to think of the Age of Sigmar equivalent, but nothing quite there. I'm still learning my Age of Sigmar. But you get these lists that, oh my god, this is the most OP. Caradron Overlords, I guess, is the scary one there. But these lists and these things, and oh my god, you got to be ready for this. So for 40k for all, it was Iron Hands. Iron Hands was everything, every tournament, and it was reflected because you do have meta chasers. Okay, so a meta chaser, quite simply, someone who just goes for the latest thing. Okay, and there is no shade on that. I will never throw shade on someone who wants to chase the meta. If that's what they want to do, power to them. It's a different skill set. If you want to stay up to date with the meta and chasing that also means you have to learn a new army every so often. And personally, don't want to do it. I stick with Marines because I'm lazy and because of money. I got plenty of them. I can pivot into most forces. I've got some fast attack stuff. I've got some heavier, shooty sort of stuff. So I can retool my list to go from the light cavalry archery setup to a heavy infantry setup. I can pivot quite quickly into either one of those options. And that's kind of where you guys want to be at, if you're going to follow that. And the other thing is you don't have to be a slave to the meta, because the next thing I want to talk to you about is the exceptions. Okay? Exceptions to the rule. If you chase the meta, if you're terrified of, oh my god, I'm going to go to this tournament and there's going to be an Iron Hands player, I'm going to be honest, outside of the ridiculousness of the initial phase of when Iron Hands came out, where you had just Space Marines dominating every single thing and Space Marines were the meta, you're probably going to be safe to just stick to your guns. And especially with the way 9th edition and the secondaries now work out, build your list to what you want it to do. Okay, that's the biggest advice I can give you. Being aware of the meta shouldn't make you a slave to it. So, for example, you've got to have an answer to things when you're building your lists. But it doesn't mean you should build your entire list on that. Your army still has to perform a task. Remember what I said. When you're building a list, you've got to look at your list and say, right, what is my win condition? How do I get there? What do I need to do? That just requires you to also factor in the meta. Quick sip. So, where do you go from there? Well, you've scoured your forums, you've gone online, you've watched your podcasts, and you're aware of it. Now, this is the part that's important. Being aware of the meta avoids what I call the Yu-Gi-Oh moment. Okay? For those of you who haven't seen, it's that classic meme of you've activated my trap card and you've fallen into something. Once you know these meta tricks and these sort of tactics and tricks, you're going to be fine. I think more players earlier on in their piece get so wound up in the meta or not knowing it that two things happen. You either A, end up being Yu-Gi-Oh'd and getting surprised and being thrown off and tilted, or B, become so goddamn hamstrung by the meta that you don't stick to your guns and you don't do what you're supposed to do. Okay? Back on our example from that battle marathon, even the good man himself, the general of the Greeks, managed to change his style. Okay? Thinned out the middle of his army so that the center crumbled and he could wrap up the Persians. That's what you've got to be able to do. He adapted to what the meta was. He adapted to what the other guy was bringing. And that's a big part of your game. Know what the strengths of your list are. Know how it interacts so it's not scary. Okay? Now I'm going to teach you something that's heretical. You can break the meta by being aware of the meta. How do you do this? Quite simple. If the meta is cracking Space Marines, for example, this was the big thing in the tournament for a while. Everyone had to be able to kill Space Marines, so you needed high AP, multi-wound weapons that could crack it. So we're talking Imperial Fists with Stalker pattern bolters that could crack armor and ruin Space Marines' days. What happens when that same list goes up against a Horde? It's not a good matchup. It's what you call a bad matchup. And that's something else you have to be aware of when you're going into this thing. Where does your list stack up against other lists? What's a good matchup? What's a bad matchup? So for me, when I was playing Iron Hands, I didn't have a lot of mobility as such. So I knew that faster, more mobile armies were going to run circles around me. They were going to take the objectives and they were going to be fine. The other one was incredibly shooty armies, like your AdMech. A lot of people said that Iron Hands had great shooting. I'm going to tell you right now, a heavy Cataphren list, like my mate Lings, just minced me. Okay? There's always going to be something that's going to trick you up. But the other thing you got to realize is if you go to a tournament, you're not just playing one game and then going home, you're playing 2 or 3 games. So the chances are you're going to have a chance to recover from that. Be aware of it, but just know that the other thing you might know is even though, say, the latest thing online is, it's got to be all these Chaplain Dreads and all these, I'm outdated here. This is an example of older meta. But, Leviathan Dreadnoughts and all this kind of stuff. Not every player is going to have that scary option. It's like being worried about a shark so much you never go to the beach. Your chances of being hit by a shark are not that bad. Likewise, if you go to a tournament, you might have one bad game, but you've got other games to make that up. And you're going to hit those bad matchups. That's all there is to it. So, how do you break meta? You take a Horde. Okay? You find out what the meta is and go, right, well, if most people are going to tailor their lists to that, what's something I can do to break that? And I think there's a lot of value in that doesn't get spoken about enough. An example from my own tabletop gaming comes from playing X-Wing. I got into X-Wing when it first started. I literally bought the box, bought a second box and a couple extra ships, and then 2 days later went in the first tournament. So very quick learning curve, but it's a beer and pretzels game. It's not exactly overly complex. Once you got your fundamentals down, it's all good. And I remember going online, and I noticed in my practice games that people were doing this. There was what they called the rule of 11. And they worked out if they deployed right on the line for their deployment with their ships, there was like an 11 range to get into shooting with their opponent. So they were already pre-estimating, and I'm sure this happens in 40k as well, so I'm sure it crosses over, estimating that if they wanted to be right on the line, they'd have to execute the following maneuvers to get into range. No worries. So the first thing I did was, okay, if that's the meta, I'm not going to do that. I would not only go off the line, so a bit back, I would then orient myself so I was on an angle. And then I would pull a random maneuver on the first turn because it would make it very hard to anticipate. Okay? So just doing that was enough to Yu-Gi-Oh people on the first turn. Okay, I went out of it for a while. I played that tournament, came fourth. Bit of controversy there. I think I was cheated by a guy. Know your ships, know your abilities, but also be aware of what other people can do, because then by accident, someone fudged the rules and got it wrong. But I went away for it for a while, came back. I think there'd been about 8 or 9 waves of new ships. So I went into a tournament blind. Okay, I had my old wave 1 list. Let's do this. So I turn up. First mission that I noticed is that the meta had changed dramatically. When I left, the dramatic need was higher numbers of ships. Okay, maybe a hero character or something like that, but mostly you'd spam ships of a lower piloting skill to get the numbers up. The classic was your angry ties, 8 just academy pilot ties. Okay, I didn't do that. I still ran with a pretty high number, but what I found out when I got back to the game was that the meta had changed dramatically. It had gone from light hordes to that heavy infantry. So now the lists were like 2 hero ships that were fully tooled up, and they could do a lot of damage. Okay, so I'm sitting there going, right, well, I've brought the chaff, and now I've got to fight that. So again, off key, off the line, slightly off-center deployment, threw people out. That still hadn't changed. Everyone was still running that rule of 11. Then what you had to do was I went, right, they've got all these abilities. How do I stop them? So for those of you not familiar with X-Wing, if 2 ships bump, okay, neither one of them gets their actions. So if the value of these hero ships is all in their actions, I just need to bump them. So I was sacrificing ships to deliberately bump. Okay? Sorry, Mr. Bond, all those abilities and no actions to perform them. That's really how it goes. It went pretty good. First table to first guy. Also, the ships I was using were out of favor. So that's another interesting thing. Taking units that people don't see a lot ends up giving you an advantage because people forget what they do. I heard this recently listening to, I think it was Priority Roll, talking about Nighthaunt, saying that so few people use them that there's just so many models and so many options in there that people don't know what they're capable of. And I'm finding that now, putting together my first Age of Sigmar list, I'm looking at the units and going, oh my god, this is fantastic. How come no one uses this? And I think the same way with the Space Marines now, like regular attack Marines. Oh, you can do this, that, and that now, but it's now viable because of this change. Second game went pretty much the same. Third game I got tabled. It happens. You have your bad matchup. But do you see what I'm trying to illustrate there? You've had your first game. Good, bad. You're going to hit that bad matchup. The bad matchup for me was the Millennium Falcon, which is just, it's so hard to kill that thing. Okay, it's really hard if you don't have the right tools because it's just so hearty. Especially if they've got some other ships like I think it's Wedge or something that stops you from being able to shoot at them. But back onto 40k and getting good at this sort of tournament scene, you need to be aware of that. Okay, you're going to have your bad matchup. So I want you to understand the meta exists, but it only exists in the respect that people are aware of it and people are prepared to be slaves to it. Because let's face it, it doesn't matter whatever the new hotness is. People might not have had the resources to run out and spend all that money on a new list. Okay, especially if your tournament is one in which, they require painted minis, because that's money spent on the minis, that's time to paint them, that's all that stuff. So, you get some time to sort of react to things. And for example, in my local meta, I don't think for a while there it was very Marine heavy. I think it was more Dark Elder were really the hotness. Orcs were really good. You weren't finding that late of meta, but then I'd read a tournament from, say, Sweden or over there, and it's like Iron Hands, Iron Hands, Iron Hands, Iron Hands. And you saw the same thing when Imperial Knights came out. It was just like Imperial Knights all the way down. Okay? So things go through these phases. It sucks, but there it is. But there's a silver lining in this, and that comes in the addressing of this. Either the community will self-police this by saying, look, this tournament's rules are X, Y, and Z. so many of this, can't have more than one of these, no Forge World or whatever. The no Forge World one is a classic around my local area. A lot of tournaments will just say, look, we're not going to have Forge World minis because it's just a nightmare. But like they will turn around, and Games Workshop themselves, once they get enough information coming through, will address things. So for example, Iron Hands, I literally bought them, like the new supplement, and 2 weeks later they nerfed it. Not even, I think it was like a week. They nerfed them with an FAQ. Okay, so things get addressed. So that's the way it works. The meta becomes a thing, it continues on for a while, and then when Games Workshop sees that, look, this is becoming a problem, they will address it and they will fix it. Okay? So, refreshing our memories, meta, most effective technique available, or tactic available. Okay? It's the spamming thing. Okay? So once that's established, you got two options. You can become slavishly reliant on it and chase it, which is, again, no harshness on anyone that wants to do that. That's entirely up to them. Okay? The other thing is you can become reactive to it and say, look, I'm aware of it. This is what I've got to do to fix that. Okay? Or you can deliberately break it. Okay, so by taking those combos that nobody sees coming, or being a horde when everyone's trying to be high AP, high damage. Okay, spamming out single wound hordes is probably going to overwhelm them. There's nothing worse than wasting a big gun on something that's too small for it to matter. That's where we're looking at. And I mean, even if you look at 9th edition as a whole, the meta's changed because it used to be a very shooty, heavy sort of game. Now with smaller tables, confined things, the need to push forward, the need for board objective to be held, it's changing things a lot. And even a lot of the secondaries require you to be in the center of the board, moving forward, pushing up. Okay? So it becomes a very different game. So what I want you to do is, you've done your reps, got your resources, and you're studying it. Just be aware of the meta, and I think choose a direction to go on it. So you're either going to be someone who chases that meta, someone who reacts to that meta, or someone who tries to go counter to the meta. Okay, it's drastically go counter to it. Okay, that's how I understand meta. Now, where am I sitting with it at the moment? On the get good scale, trying. I've had a couple games, done really badly, getting better. Okay, I've picked up the Indomitus box set, so I'll be readjusting my list. I think I'm probably going to go in a more combat heavy thing, but now with the release of all the Marine changes, I'm very tempted to push back to some classic Firstborn Marines. I can see a place in my list to run those 10 Terminators going forward, because a unit of 5 guys with Thunder Hammers sounds absolutely amazing right now. Your Khan is very pleased by the addition of those rules. I can really see myself sinking my teeth into Terminators. If I could pull off a full first company force, I'd love it, but I need to get my hands on more of the Heroes Terminators because I just think they're a bit more dynamically posed. I think they're more interesting. The other thing I might do is bring back my Razorbacks. So the other thing is what you're going to do with those. I'll tell you something that's changed. So from 8th to 9th edition, the changes of the rules for tanks is a big one. A lot of people hated what happened to tanks because you just tag them or tri-point them and they'd be shut down, useless. Then what you got to see was people pushing up now. Like, I run angry tanks now, so I don't care if I get into combat with you. In fact, my last game against Tyranids, I deliberately charged. It was the funniest thing of the whole game, charging a Razorback into combat, knowing that the next turn I could just go shooting phase, spray down, and then fight you for another round. These things change. The game changes. And the other thing I want you to remember as well, just as our good friend Darius learned, different areas, different metas, different strokes for different folks. Just because, you might have read 20 things online that say the new meta is this, you might not see that reflected in your local area. And the other thing that's going to make it very difficult at the moment is because we do have Nurgle-19 or coronavirus kicking around, meta changes and meta updates require games and stats and numbers coming in and information coming in, and unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get that proper number. So this is where knowing your local area comes in really handy. I don't think we're going to get a reflective ninth ed meta proper probably until I want to say next year. That's probably a big call, and I'm happy to hang my Khan hood on that one. But I really think that until we get regular tournament scenes happening again, and there's Tabletop Simulator, I'm not knocking it. It's good, but again, that sample size isn't probably big enough to really warrant calling it a meta. It's probably a meta in its own right, but it's a meta for that community. Okay. I'm hoping this is making a lot of sense for you new players, because this is something that I think you really need to be aware of, knowing what you can do and knowing what can be done to you as a result of being a part of that meta. I think that's important. Otherwise, you're going to end up being Datus sitting there watching your ships burn, wondering what the hell happened. I think you just need to be aware of it. Okay? So I want to finish on that point. So again, to summarize, know your meta, decide whether you're going to approach it as a follower, as a reactor, or as a subverter, and then write your lists. Okay? So to finish, I just want to give you some of the wisdom of the Khan. So again, it's very easy to write a list. It is another thing entirely to put it on the table and play it. Until next time, keep trying to get good. Enjoy the game. Find some time to paint. Hopefully you've been looking at more of those resources online. I will note Priority Roll is another one, because I've just been enjoying their work so much lately, especially if you're going into Age of Sigmar. I found myself needing to get that information, so that's been fun. Again, check out the boys over at Down Under 40K Podcast, and just have a good one. Your Khan always appreciates you. As always, come and talk again soon. Hospitality is sacred.